whether the listener is a legacy fundraiser or not, I'm so fascinated to hear as to what you discovered are the things that the successful organisations manage to do if they are to break down these silos and get people across the organisation and outside of it talking about something like legacies.
The advice to us was that those people then essentially kind of bring the vast majority of the organisation along with them.
If you think it through and you get both the concept and the tone right, then the number of people who think it was a mere gimmick are relatively few, and the number of people who are really pleased you did it tend to be high.
Yeah, and I suppose we think about those wow moments for our donors, but not necessarily for our colleagues.
Hi, this is Rob Woods and welcome to episode 130 of the Fundraising Bright Spots podcast. This is the show for anyone who works in fundraising, looking for ideas and maybe a little dose of inspiration to help you raise more money and really enjoy your job. Now the show has grown so much since those first few episodes that I tentatively shared in the autumn of 2019, I realised that if you started listening in the last couple of years, there's a really good chance that you've never heard some of our early episodes. And to me, that's a shame because some of those early topics are still as relevant today as they ever were, and we got some really great feedback about many of them. So I've decided that when I have time, I'm going to share some of these popular episodes from the archive. One of the questions which I think is still so relevant for many charities is, how do we break down the so-called silo mentality so that everyone in the charity is contributing to their overall mission and acting consistently with that, irrespective of the specialist focus of their role? For instance, one wasted opportunity for many charities is for people who care about our cause to better understand the benefits of legacy giving and to potentially leave a gift in their will. So I'm really pleased to share this popular episode with Dr. Claire Routley, which we recorded in March 2020. Clearly, the world has changed a lot since then. But at a time when, because of increased home working, silo mentality is often a tougher challenge than ever, I believe that Claire's ideas on this subject are still incredibly relevant. I hope you find it helpful.
Hello again, Dr. Claire Routley.
Hello.
So here we are for the second half of my conversation with Dr. Claire Routley to do with legacy fundraising, but the slant on this one is going to be different from the last episode. The context is that we are both here to speak at the very excellent National Association of Hospice Fundraisers Conference, and I was just having a really interesting chat with Claire in the lobby just now and couldn't resist seeking her views on a really valuable topic for the listeners to the podcast. And in a moment, I'll tee it up for why I think it's so important. But just a little context, in case you didn't hear the previous episode, which is more about how to have a conversation about gifts in wills with your supporter, any kind of supporter, community, major donor, marathon runner. That was the last episode. But before we get on to this particular episode, Claire, your company is called Legacy Fundraising. You've worked in fundraising for 15 years, including as a trust fundraiser. And now your specialist focus is in legacy fundraising, is that right?
Yes. In a slightly backwards way, I did my PhD in legacy, worked out it was really interesting, and then actually moved to work in that area. So
fantastic. And the bit of research you mentioned, really piqued my interest because, as I understand it, the National Trust asked you to do a piece of research, not so much to do with legacies pure, but into organisations that manage to get this notion of legacy fundraising being a normal thing to talk about across departments. They were curious about how to make an organisation maybe be more holistic in their approach to legacy fundraising. Can you tell me a tiny bit about what that research was and particularly what the methodology was of that research?
Yeah, we were basically looking at organisations that were doing this well, that were being successful in integrating that legacy message across the rest of the organisation. And so we did a quick literature review, and then the exciting bit really was we went out and talked to people that we knew were really good in this space and also got them to recommend other organisations that were good at this. And I suppose the literature review really was just to say, some of this stuff is really good change management, actually. As you were saying, Rob, a lot of this applies much wider than just the legacy sphere. So we were able to back up what people were telling us with some more sort of academic evidence as well, really. And I suppose I should say anything that I say in this podcast, I have to say a huge thank you to National Trust for letting us share some of this with the sector more widely, to my colleague Christine Reedy, who worked with me on it, and to actually the brilliant legacy fundraisers that are doing this really well, because people were doing work that was far more sophisticated, to be honest, than I was expecting to find when I started. And like I said, work that really kind of aligns with what change management tells us is good as well. So it's all credit to them rather than me, really.
And if the listener works in a fairly small organisation and there's only 3 of you in an office, maybe this is not a massive deal, because you really, I hope all 3 of you are driven primarily by the overall outcome we're trying to make for our beneficiaries, and therefore how finances and successful fundraising can achieve that. So it may not feel hard that we need to be talking to each other, and the overall goal of more satisfied supporters and therefore more long-term and generous supporters who might help in several different ways, both as a major donor and leaving a gift in their will, that all might feel fairly easy if you're in a smaller organisation, or it might not. But my experience is in medium-sized and large organisations, the truth is it's much harder than most people think it will be to help people think bigger picture rather than just focusing on what they thought their job was to do, which is to raise major gifts or bring in corporate partnerships or get people running the marathons or get legacies. The very most successful fundraising organisations are donor focused, and they have a culture, therefore, that is holistic about helping the donor do what they want to care about this cause, rather than being silo-ish and what any given internal target might appear to want. So I think whether the listener is a legacy fundraiser or not, I'm so fascinated to hear as to what you discovered are the things that the successful organisations manage to do if they are to break down these silos and get people across the organisation and outside of it talking about something like legacies.
Yeah, so I suppose to summarise it, really, there were sort of 3 key areas that came up. So there was people, and how you go about sort of talking with, engaging with your colleagues. Then communications, so looking at that whole area of how do we communicate these messages out internally. I mean, obviously those 2 are interrelated to a high degree, but they were 2 sort of clear themes, I suppose. And then the final one was around sort of measurement and how you actually measure effectively what's happening within, obviously for this study, legacies particularly, and how well it's been integrated.
Fantastic. So do you want to jump into that first theme of people and tell me about an organisation or 2 that you discovered was doing this pretty well, and some of the tactics that you really liked that they were using?
Well, at the core of it really was having somebody who was sort of leading on this project. I suppose was probably the legacy fundraiser, but who was really passionate about this stuff. So I loved, actually one person said to me that internally they call him Dan the legacy man, because whenever there's a team meeting or he bumps into you in the kitchen, he's there sort of really bigging up legacies, telling little stories. And actually I went to Australia last year, and I was sort of talking about Dan the legacy man, and somebody was like, oh my goodness, they call me Esther the bequester over here. So tip number 1, have a name that rhymes with something legacy related is a good start, but have that passionate person. And I suppose have the courage to admit if it's not you, if you are the legacy lead, but you find it really difficult to go and sort of engage with your colleagues or big it up, whatever it might be, find that passionate person that's going to lead on this internal engagement project for you.
Great tip. So it is true that in personality-wise, some people find it much more enticing and enjoyable to be endlessly out and about in the corridors and having chats, doing small talk. And if that's not you, but your organisation really needs to get legacies on the map, then it's fine for it not to be you, but who else could play that role on your behalf? Thinking that through sounds like a good tip. What else in terms of the theme of people did you notice was going on when this was working successfully?
So the people that were very good at this were then basically saying, well, who are the the champions internally, so your sort of wider core group, really. And I'm not quoting exactly because I forget exactly how they phrased it, but someone said, find those passionate people internally that do everything. If there's a organisation bake sale, they'll be there with baking the cakes, and so that's not necessarily the chief executive or the chair of trustees. Sometimes it's the person on reception that's been there for 20 years and knows everything about everybody, and it's that happy smiley face you see in the morning type person. So
that's a really interesting point. Be a student of the, for want of a better word, the politics and the power dynamics across your organisation, and sometimes it will be in line with the formal hierarchy. And sometimes there's some other people who are not heads of team, but actually are also, in a loud way or in a quiet way, are strong characters that others respect. And you're saying when organisations were good at this, they found the right champions and talked to them one-to-one, help them understand, meet their objections and help them understand what it was we were asking you to do. And then the more formal cultural change efforts succeeded because people were on side and people who had influence were on side.
Yeah, they essentially, the advice to us was that those people then essentially kind of bring the vast majority of the organisation along with them. And what was interesting, not everybody, but some people were sort of formally appointing these people as champions. So one organisation would have some formal recognition, give them a mug as legacy champion. And they said they really appreciated that, actually, that sort of that internal recognition. But, not everybody. Sometimes that was a looser, more informal structure.
All of that said, I'd love to move on to theme number 2 that you mentioned, which is broadly ways of communicating the fact that you would love people across the organisation to understand what legacies are and be able to do their bit in this area. Couple of things you noticed that were done well in this area, both sort of conventional and obvious things, and also maybe there's some standout things that you thought, well, of course that worked. You could hardly ignore that.
Yeah. So in terms of sort of the standard things, including legacy in induction was quite good. So, right from the entry into the organisation, people were socialised into understanding that this was an important income stream, that it doesn't come from the legacy fairy, but it's actually fundraised and, an important part of these relationships that they hold. So having it there from sort of day one, or at least the first week, is great. Legacy training, again, the idea of giving people, and I'm paraphrasing from the wonderful Stephen George here, but tools and confidence around legacy conversations so that, you're breaking down some of those worries or barriers that they have. But I think the really fun thing that we talked to people about was legacy awareness weeks. So a lot of people were aligned with, the Remember Charities Awareness Week, which happens in September, which is sort of external facing. A lot of people were taking that and thinking about how do I use this as an internal engagement opportunity. Some people were having their week or sometimes even their month, a different time of year, but it sort of makes sense, I think, to align with when the sector generally has been a bit more noisy around this. So having some sort of internal awareness period, focus period. And again, people were doing lots of interesting things there. So taking over the internal intranet, sending around quizzes, chocolate on desks.
Quizzes about legacies or quizzes about...
Yeah, all the fun things about, unusual wills or sometimes, unusual gifts that the organisation had. So much kind of interesting meat there in legacy. This wasn't this study, but someone mentioned at one of the IOF's legacy special interest groups recently, which I thought was amazing. They did a story. I'm trying to think, it was a Twitter story or using Slack or one of those sorts of things. So they had a short, few paragraph long story with a bit of a legacy theme, and they sort of dotted the different sentences of this story around the organisation. So whoever had sentence 1 had to find it and put it up, and then whoever had sentence 2 had to kind of then go on and add to the story. And she said it just became like everyone was, I suppose it was that period, I think it might have been coming up to Christmas, and when it's slightly kind of, people are kind of looking for a bit of fun, aren't they, at that time. And people got really engaged in this story.
Love that. So you've got one piece of the jigsaw.
Yeah. And
it means very little
until
you have to go and find someone else, and you're, as a tip, that's a brilliant metaphor.
Such a good idea, wasn't it? And again, all of this being other people's ideas that I'm, stealing for future use. But she said, people got really excited, and it got to a point there was a bit of a sort of hold up. So it was like, who's got sentence 6? Because they really wanted to see what happened in the story. So some really fun sort of internal engagements. But particularly, I also loved the idea that one hospice had essentially someone dressing up as a giant cat. With the idea being, has the cat got your tongue? I.e., you're not having legacy conversations, and just kind of went around the office dressed as this cat, and crashed into meetings, and I think these sorts of things really sort of help to overcome that other barrier to legacies, that it's just a bit boring. People think, it's legal, it's death, it's why would I want to get engaged with it, because it's just not fun. It's actually doing these really sort of fun, transgressive things.
Yes, I love this, and it would fit really beautifully into a theme I've been really interested in the last 3 years, which I call creating wow moments.
Yes,
where you create surprise or delight just beyond what normal fundraising does, what normal colleagues or what normal donors would remotely expect you to do. That's precisely why, if you can take a deep breath and be that bit more bold, bit more bespoke, bit more creative, it adds up to a bigger difference, because finally cut through, and especially if it's playfully, is done with the right tone, then people are less likely to just write it off as a mere gimmick. If your tone is right, and there's something about the hook, about something about the reason for doing this particular fun, different treatment that is more noticeable, that does in due course make sense to the overall message you've got, the main story you're trying to get across, whatever you're trying to promote within your organisation, our experience is far better to take that risk and cut through than take the risk of just sending round more emails and doing another dull 5 minutes in some team meetings, saying all the things that people expected you to say. Now, you can get it wrong. You can do this tactic and it just be pure gimmick, and there's no substance to it. You don't explain why you did it. And then I understand why people would, at some level, be justified in their cynicism. You interrupted their team meeting and you should be back at work rather than dressing up as a cat. But my view is, if you think it through and you get both the concept and the tone right, then the number of people who think it was a mere gimmick are relatively few, and the number of people who are really pleased you did it tend to be high.
Hi, it's Rob, and I wanted to let you know about our 2 flagship training programs designed to help you grow high-value fundraising results. That's the Corporate Partnerships Mastery Program and the Major Gifts Mastery Program. These programs help you make progress through a combination of masterclasses and individual coaching support. To give you a sense of some of the ways they help you make progress, here's a short clip with a fundraiser named Danny Knight, who took part in our most recent Corporate Mastery Program.
I would absolutely wholeheartedly recommend it. In fact, I actually already have recommended it within our organisation. I think that the attitude towards corporate fundraising that is celebrated in the course and that is taught through the course is genuinely the right way to go about it. And it's not one that will necessarily occur naturally to fundraisers who have sort of grown up with a philanthropic ideal of what fundraising is and maybe what it should be. And certainly for me, being able to learn about that, share that experience with other corporate fundraising specialists, and to then communicate it internally with our senior leadership team, have that vision and really push forward, has been incredibly valuable for me, for my personal development, but actually it's absolutely paid dividends for the business as a whole. So as a worthwhile tool, worthwhile piece of training, it absolutely cannot be undervalued. I've loved it.
To find out more about either programme, go to brightspotfundraising.co.uk/services. Now though, let's get back to my conversation with Claire Routley.
I suppose we think about those wow moments for our donors, but not necessarily for our colleagues. And I suppose just you've made me think overall, there's so many parallels between, we have an external marketing plan or an external fundraising plan. And actually, if you're going to do this stuff well, you need something that mirrors that internally.
Yeah, that's absolutely my observation about it, especially if success in growing legacies overall comes from us making better use of these high quality relationships that all the different people in the charity have with their supporters, rather than legacy fundraising being a thing that happens 6 times a year when there is a legacy mailing. It's just absolute madness, I think, to keep sending that stuff out and not be having chats with the people you're regularly meeting anyway because they're running a marathon for you.
Yeah, and I suppose the other really good point is just, and again, applies to fundraising overall, doesn't it, really, but telling stories. Because there are so many brilliant stories around legacies, you know, around the people that have left them, around the slightly unusual gifts sometimes, around their motives, around what you've done with the money. So, you know, just keep telling those stories, again, as you would externally, but keep telling those sort of stories internally. And actually National Trust shared with us, they had a really nice billboard, I suppose you'd call it, in one of their properties where it said, you know, are you curious about what's going on in the arbour, let's call it. I'm misquoting again slightly, but, you know, actually we're replanting all the trees and this is because we've had a legacy to pay for it. So, yeah, you know, encouraging people internally to use those, well, telling those stories to your colleagues and then encouraging your colleagues to tell those stories to potential donors as well. Because, again, what a lovely, gentle way of promoting legacies in a, you know, non-scary fashion. It's just to tell these little stories about, you know, what your organisation has had and what it's done with it and what an amazing difference they make.
And then, Claire, in terms of that third theme of measurement, what did you notice from this research project that the more successful organisations were doing?
Well, it was a little bit of a mixed bag, whereas the other two themes, there seemed to be some really clear ideas coming out. In terms of measurement, there was, I suppose, almost two schools of thought. So in one school of thought, they were saying, well, actually, you know, we set quite hard targets for our colleagues, often around, you know, you have to have X number of legacy conversations a month or a year or whatever it might be.
So not counting pledges, but please record the number of times per month you mentioned legacies to your supporter.
Yeah. Whereas some other organisations, it was a much softer measurement. And so I was interested, I suppose, in the one organisation where they said, actually, what I measure is the amount of leaflets and pens and, you know, legacy marketing collateral that is ordered, because actually that's a sign that my colleagues are out there sharing this stuff, having conversations. And so for her and her organisation, she thought that was more effective than trying to very specifically target colleagues. Although, again, I'm kind of slightly torn on this as well, really, whether the hard or the soft measurement is the better way to go. Although one organisation was saying, well, actually, by making sure people do have targets and measuring the conversations that they're having, that then really helps over the longer term, because actually in a couple of years' time, 5-6 years' time perhaps, be able to sort of go back to people and say, you know, we're starting to get these legacies in, and actually that was a result of the conversation that you had. So to be able to sort of close that feedback loop, which again I thought was a very astute point. But I think it probably depends a bit on the culture of your organisation as well, whether the sort of levels of targeting people have, even to whether, you know, legacies will fit into that. So I guess it's finding a route forward, whether the sort of the hard or the softer measurements are better for you, really, I think.
And just before we finish this bit of the conversation, you've talked about those three themes. Having, I guess, your original PhD was all about why people give, and then this particular piece of research was what is it that organisations do when they're more holistic in their approach. Any last idea we may not have yet stressed from this research project that you think is useful for the listener to know about?
Do you know, one thing I'm going to just add, which applies to all of the above, really, the people, the stories, the measurement, is just keep going as well. So I think sometimes where these efforts fail is where it's, and I think I mentioned in the previous episode actually, someone's just brought in to do some training and that's it. You know, then the organisation expects this amazing transformation, but it's a real long-term process, and I guess it can feel quite difficult to constantly be banging this drum. But again, what someone said to me, which I thought again was a really, you know, it's really sort of stuck in my mind, was the point at which you're becoming really bored at talking about this is the point at which it's just starting to register with your audience. So you think your colleagues are absolutely sick of you talking about legacies, and actually it's only just starting to, you know, even kind of make it onto their radar, really. You know, the last time you had the conversation, they were just thinking about what they were going to have for lunch. So you've just got to keep banging on at it and doing the hard graft. You know, it's not a one-shot exercise.
Yeah, very wise words, and I've heard that advice on all the different topics I have on this podcast, that it's every now and again you get a lucky early win, but the more normal change curve and results curve is about incremental gains and the early part of the graph, the universe does not often send you a major early results. It often takes longer than you think it possibly should, but that's the time when you keep going, and if you can, then in due course you reach the tipping point and suddenly this becomes more and more A, normal, and B, also results start to show as well.
Absolutely.
So Claire, if people wanted to get in touch with you, are you on LinkedIn? Are you on Twitter? I'd love to hear what they think about this episode. So if they want to find you, how could they do that?
So yes, I do tweet lots of legacy-related things, so come and join the conversation. I'm on the worst Twitter name to actually say out loud, because it's Clary Jane R, so Claire with an I and a Y on the end, Jane R.
Fantastic. So we would love to hear what you think about this. Do get in touch. We'll get back to you. Claire, if people want your advice, what's your website?
Oh yes, legacyfundraising.co.uk.
Fantastic. Claire, I've learned so much today. This is such an important topic. Whether what we're trying to do is legacies or anything else that actually our organisation needs to be more holistic about rather than silo-ish about. I've learned a lot. Thank you ever so much for sharing your ideas, and I look forward to talking to you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for sharing them with me in the first place.
Bye-bye, Claire. Bye.
Bye.
So there you go. I hope you found Claire's insights useful. As usual, on the blog and podcast section of my Bright Spot Fundraising website, I'll put a summary of the key ideas and a transcript of the interview, as well as a link to the excellent book Legacy and In-Memory Fundraising, which Claire co-edited with Sebastian Wilberforce. If you're interested in other ideas to do with legacies, then as well as checking out Claire's website, I recommend you have a listen to episode 28 of this podcast, which is also with Claire, about how to have a conversation with a charity supporter about legacy giving. And if you like the podcast, please remember to subscribe today, and it would be fantastic if you could share it on with your colleagues, or just take a moment to leave a kind review wherever you get your podcasts, which really helps other fundraisers to find this free resource. If you want to get in touch, we're both on LinkedIn, and on Twitter, Claire is at Clary Jane R with a capital J and a capital R, and I am at Woods_Rob. Finally, thank you so much for listening today. And until the next time, good luck with all your fundraising efforts.